Welcome back to Crimetime Inc.
Oh, yeah, this one is something else.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole 1968 Democratic National Convention thing.
Yeah.
Because it really wasn't just your typical political event.
Right.
It was this crazy mix of politics and protest. And 1968 in America, man, that was a tense year, to say the least.
Yeah.
I mean, the Vietnam War, racial tensions, still simmering, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. I mean, it's like the whole country was just this powder keg just waiting to explode.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that both the protesters and the city officials knew things could get out of hand.
Right.
It wasn't a matter of if something would happen, but when and how bad would it be?
Yeah, that's a good point. And both sides were like meticulously planning for this.
Oh, yeah, they were ready.
So you've got anti-war groups like the MOBE.
Right, the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam.
Right.
Yeah, MOBE for short. And then you have the Yippies, who were really known for their more theatrical and provocative style of protest.
Yeah.
They like to make a statement.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have Mayor Richard J. Daley, like completely determined to maintain law and order in Chicago.
Oh, yeah. Daley was all about law and order, and that's really important to understand how things escalated.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't just reacting to the protests. He was proactively trying to control the situation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he called in thousands of police officers, the National Guard, even the U.S. Army was there. It's almost like he was preparing for a battle, not a political convention.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, this huge show of force must have created an environment where any little challenge to authority was going to be met with, like, extreme measures.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And then just days before the convention even starts, this teenager, Dean Johnson, is shot by police for violating curfew. And it just instantly heightened tensions.
Yeah, of course.
So the Yippies and the STS, they tried to hold a memorial for Johnson, but even that small gathering was met with police orders to keep moving.
It's like the stage is already set for conflict before the convention even officially began.
Oh, absolutely. And the Yippies being the Yippies, they were already pushing the boundaries.
Right.
They tried to nominate Pegasus for president.
Who is Pegasus?
Pegasus was a pig.
Okay, a pig for president.
A 150-pound pig that they wanted to be president.
Wow.
And they organized music festivals in Lincoln Park directly challenging the city's curfew.
So basically every action was a deliberate challenge to Daley's whole vision of law and order.
You got it. And Daley's response tightened his grip even further.
So what did he do?
Denied permits for marches, increased police presence, relentlessly enforced that park curfew.
Uh-huh.
It was a clear message dissent would not be tolerated.
Wow.
You had these two forces, these two ideologies on a collision course.
Right.
The tension was palpable.
You could practically feel it jumping off the pages of these sources.
Oh, yeah.
So what happens next? I mean, the clash of ideologies seems inevitable at this point.
Well, things escalate quickly from there, culminating in what's often called the turning point, the events of Monday, August 26th.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's hear about it.
Yeah.
What happened on August 26th?
Grant Park became a flashpoint.
Okay.
This park was just across from the Conrad Hilton Hotel where the whole convention was being held.
Right.
Imagine the scene. Protesters and police clashing in this very public space.
Uh-huh.
The tension thicker than the summer air.
Sounds chaotic. What exactly was happening in the park?
Skirmishes everywhere, protesters climbing the General John Logan Memorial, people getting hurt.
No.
Our sources detail a young man having his arm broken during an arrest.
Oh.
You can practically feel the tension escalating with every passing hour.
Sounds like things are spiraling out of control.
And they do. Early morning on Wednesday, August 28th, everything explodes.
Okay.
5,000 protesters gathered in front of the Conrad Hilton chanting slogans and waving signs.
Uh-huh.
Daley responds by ordering 800 National Guardsmen to confront them.
Wow, so you have armed troops facing down their own citizens? I mean, it's hard to even picture that happening today. Armed troops on the streets of an American city during a political convention.
I know, and the whole world was watching this unfold on television. This wasn't happening in the shadows.
Right.
The iconic chant,
Yeah.
the whole world is watching, emerged from that very chaos.
Wow.
As the protesters tried to push toward the Hilton to make their voices heard, the police and National Guard met them with brutal force.
Okay, what kind of force are we talking about here?
We're talking tear gas batons, people being shoved through plate glass windows.
Oh my gosh.
It was absolute chaos.
Wow.
And that phrase, the whole world is watching, perfectly captures the magnitude of what was happening.
Right.
It wasn't just a local event. It was a symbol of America's deep internal divisions.
Yeah, and these divisions weren't limited to the streets either.
Right.
I mean, they were playing out inside the convention hall too.
Yeah, they were.
Our sources detail these heated arguments between delegates over the Vietnam War, civil rights, the future of the Democratic Party. It's like a nation at odds with itself.
Exactly. And then you have this unbelievable moment where Senator Abraham Ribicoff, during a live televised speech, denounces the police violence happening right outside.
No way.
He even calls it Gestapo tactics,
Whoa.
a direct and very public rebuke of Mayor Daley's law and order approach.
So you have this perfect storm brewing protests outside, political battles inside, and the whole world watching it all unfold on their television screens.
It really does capture the essence of 1968, a year of turmoil and upheaval. And the aftermath of the convention with the investigations and trials only cemented the idea that 1968 was a pivotal moment in American history.
Yeah, it wasn't just a news story. It felt like a symptom of something much deeper, a crack in the foundation of American society.
Right. And we need to remember the human cost of all this.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the politics and the big picture, but these sources are filled with stories of hundreds injured, thousands arrested.
Right. It's important to remember those individual stories, those individual lives impacted by these events. Okay, so let's talk about the aftermath. We have the Walker Report, commissioned by the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence,
Right.
and then the City of Chicago's own report. What were their conclusions?
Well, they paint very different pictures of what happened, as you might expect.
Okay.
The Walker Report was incredibly detailed based on hundreds of interviews.
Right.
And it concluded that the violence was a police riot.
A police riot.
They argued that the police were the primary aggressors and their actions were excessive and indiscriminate.
Did the City of Chicago agree with this assessment?
Not at all. They
Yeah.
completely rejected that conclusion.
Really?
Their report blamed outside agitators, basically saying the protesters were the ones who instigated the violence.
Oh, wow.
The police, they argued, were simply responding to provocations.
So we have two reports,
Yeah.
two very different interpretations. Who was really to blame for the violence?
Like most historical events, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. There's no doubt that some protesters were looking for a confrontation, that they were prepared to use violence to make their point.
Wow.
But it's also clear that the police response was excessive, that they used force against protesters, bystanders, and even journalists without justification.
And it's important to remember this was happening against the backdrop of a deeply divided nation.
Absolutely.
The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the assassinations of King and Kennedy, all of this had created a climate of fear, anger, and distrust.
Absolutely. And those divisions were reflected in the public's response to the events in Chicago.
Really?
You might think that seeing images of police brutality on TV would spark outrage.
Right.
But polls showed that a majority of Americans actually sided with the police.
Why do you think that is? Why would the public side with the police after witnessing such brutality?
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
The protesters were often viewed as troublemakers, disrespectful of authority, a threat to the social order. This fear of social upheaval, amplified by media portrayals at the time, likely contributed to the public siding with those upholding law and order.
So the violence in Chicago, rather than prompting a shift in public opinion, actually reinforced existing beliefs and prejudices.
Exactly.
It seems like people saw what they wanted to see, interpreting events through their own ideological lens.
Exactly. And this brings us to the trial, another significant event in the aftermath of the convention.
Right. This wasn't just a trial about 8 individuals. It felt like a trial about the soul of America, a clash between the establishment and the counterculture.
It was a theatrical trial filled with drama and these larger-than-life personalities clashing both inside and outside the courtroom.
Right.
You had Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, the Yippie leaders, using the trial as a platform to mock the establishment. They challenged the very concept of authority.
And then there was Bobby Seale, the Black Panther leader.
Right.
Our sources describe him being bound and gagged in the courtroom after repeated clashes with the judge.
It was a powerful image.
Yeah, a stark visual representation of the racial tensions that were also at play.
Absolutely. And while the defendants were eventually acquitted of the conspiracy charges, the trial itself became a symbol of the broader cultural and political battles engulfing America.
Right.
It reflected the struggle between traditional values and the desire for radical change.
So we have this incredibly potent story. A city on edge, a nation deeply divided, a political convention collapsing into chaos and violence, and the whole world watching.
And the legacy of those events is still felt today.
Yeah.
Our understanding of protests, police violence, and the influence of media on public opinion were all shaped by what transpired in Chicago in 1968.
Mm.
It forced America to confront some difficult questions about its own identity, its values, and its future.
Speaking of those lasting impacts, let's talk about how the events of 1968 changed the political landscape, particularly within the Democratic Party itself.
Yeah.
I mean, they were at the heart of this storm, weren't they?
Absolutely. They were the party in power responsible for the Vietnam War and struggling to navigate these incredible social and political upheavals.
Yeah.
The 1968 convention exposed the deep rift within the party, the old guard versus the new generation.
Mhm.
You had figures like Mayor Daley and Hubert Humphrey who believed in order and incremental change.
Right.
And then those like Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern representing the protesters' calls for radical change.
So it sounds like a party struggling to hold itself together.
That's a good way to put it. And this internal struggle led to significant reforms within the party.
Okay, what kind of reforms?
The McGovern-Fraser Commission was formed to examine the nominating process,
Okay.
and they recommended substantial changes to make it more inclusive and democratic.
Were these changes effective? Did they achieve their intended purpose?
They were incredibly impactful.
Right.
Those changes led to the primary and caucus system we have today,
Oh, wow.
allowing ordinary voters a greater say in choosing their party's nominee.
So the events of 1968, as chaotic and violent as they were, actually played a role in shaping the modern political landscape.
Exactly.
They forced the Democratic Party to confront its internal divisions, address the demands of a changing society, and rethink how it chose its leaders.
Precisely. And these changes didn't just impact the Democratic Party.
All right.
The Republican Party adapted as well, becoming more focused on mobilizing their base and appealing to cultural anxieties, very much like Richard Nixon did in his Law and Order campaign following the convention.
It's fascinating how these moments of intense conflict and upheaval can act as catalysts for change.
Yeah, they really can.
They force us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question our assumptions, and to reimagine what's possible.
You're absolutely right. While the legacy of 1968 is complex and debated, there's no doubt that it left a permanent mark on American history.
Right.
It continues to shape our political discourse even today.
So what can we learn from all of this?
Yeah.
What does 1968 tell us about ourselves, about our society, about the power of protests?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we should never underestimate the power of ordinary people to challenge the status quo and demand change. We see that power in the protests and the voices that rose up, demanding a more just and equitable world.
And we also see the dangers of unchecked authority, the potential for violence when dissent is silenced.
Absolutely.
That law and order rhetoric, while appealing to some, can be used to suppress those fighting for positive change.
Exactly. As we face our own challenges today, wars, violence, social and political polarization, we can look back at 1968 as a reminder that change is possible, but it often comes at a price.
Yeah.
It requires us to be engaged, informed, and willing to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult.
Our dynamic duo will discuss this subject as well as all of our other cases from this week in their weekly review show tomorrow. But in the meantime, tune in on Monday for another great true crime episode.